Economists have way too many variables to control, and so now we have a whole lot of jobs in the government and with all these central banking institutions that start to create policy for individuals that interfere with free exchange. And to me, it's free exchange that really helps us out, where we get to choose where we spend our money, and we choose how we earn that money, and we choose how to interact with each other. But instead we go, oh, no, we need Big Brother. We need other people to make decisions for us because we're not smart enough to make those decisions. And as people start to make that, we lose responsibility. And as we lose responsibility, we lose prosperity. So I'm really concerned about the term healthy inflation and where that was really born and where that comes from. Hey, Garrett Gunderson here, and I don't know, inflation sounds like things should be rising, but apparently money's flaccid. And I'm going to do a little reaction video here to inflation because, as you already know from your experience, it exists, but just how bad? Let's see what Graham has to say about it.
So as most of you know, I usually intro my videos with a "What's up, you guys, it's Graham here." But the only thing up today is inflation, and it's getting much, much worse than most of us initially expected. Throughout the last week, it was revealed that prices have surged to their highest level in 30 years. The cost of living has increased 6.2% year over year, and even worse is that it's not expected to stop anytime soon.
And part of the issue here with inflation is when they look at something called the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, a lot of times they're putting in salary increases which aren't going up as the same rate as what the actual goods and services that we're buying. I mean, a lot of people know the major things, whether it's gas or groceries, that they're starting to notice a difference with. And I'm just going to say this right out the bat. Like, it's critical that you have assets that are inflation adjusted, because as prices continue to go up, assets can start to go up as well. But for those that don't own it, it's going to be kind of a punishing system here.
As we can already see, food prices are up another 8.6%. Gasoline rose 64% to its highest level in 7 years.
First time I saw this video, but we just used the same thing, so we must be on the same level here. Okay.
Rents are up another 16.4% this year alone. In fact,
again, kind of nice if you're a landlord and then rents are up 16.4%, maybe not as good as you're a tenant, so that's why we really have to understand this and navigate it properly.
The situation is so bad that rising inflation is taken away from the average worker's wage increases, meaning you're effectively now making less money than you were before. And arguably the most...
Right, when you think about it, when the government prints money, it's a stealth tax. Essentially, you're not having to write a check for it to pay the tax, but in order to get the goods and services, you have to pay more for those goods and services. So it's kind of like this easier way to collect money to a certain degree.
Most debated topic throughout the foreseeable future is going to be: how much worse can things get? How much longer is this going to continue? What's the root cause of the issue? And where could I invest my money today so that it suddenly doesn't go up in flames? Because let's be real, even though inflation has seemingly turned into a political negotiation tactic, there's a lot that they're not telling you. And the real answer is a lot worse than just printing a whole bunch of money, even though that's a part of it.
Yeah, and they're not even printing it. Like, could you actually print trillions of dollars over a month? No, they're just adding it to computer screens. It's just showing up in the digital world. For every dollar that's actually out there that's in print, there's a lot more that are in circulation, and that's a big part of the issue here.
But before we start, in typical YouTube fashion, it would mean a lot to me if you inflated that like button for the YouTube algorithm. Just one gentle like button stimulus helps out my channel tremendously by recommending this video to a brand new audience who could also inflate the like button for the YouTube algorithm and repeat the process over again. So thank you guys so much for doing that. And with that said, let's begin. All right, so to start things off, here's the big scary word that investors and politicians hate more than YouTube removing the dislike button, and that would be inflation. This is the rate that products and services increase in price over time, lowering the value of the money that you have today. Like, remember...
What's kind of interesting is because of technological change, there are certain things that while we're buying them cost less today, but we're replacing them at a more rapid rate. So technological change, you're buying things you didn't buy before, even though they're becoming more competitive in price because they're built more efficiently. We have to take into consideration there's more to inflation because there's planned obsolescence, things break down, we have to replace them. There's technological change that I mentioned. And for me, there's propensity to consume, or as my wife likes to say, a luxury once enjoyed becomes a necessity. Look, I used to think Sizzler was considered fine dining, and sure, it's fine if you're starving, but not as in nice or elegant. So once you've got food at better places like Chili's, it's hard to go back.
When your grandparents used to tell you stories about the old days when a movie would cost $0.25, or how a brand new Ferrari 250 GTO was only $18,000 when it first came out in 19...
Or like my grandparents bought their house for $5,000. I mean, you're not getting much to live in that today's world.
1862? Well, that doesn't exist anymore, thanks to inflation. It's generally thought that the more money gets printed into our economy.
By the way, part of the problem with inflation is we have the centralized banking system where we can fractionalize, where $1 is spent more than one time. So if you go get a loan from a bank for $10,000, then you put it back into the banking system to go utilize that money. That money is then lent out again with a little bit of a reserve requirement. And so that just keeps happening. And then we also have the fact that the government's, adding so much money with the Federal Reserve and just putting that into the system because, people got checks that just came in because they're talking about, hey, we have a difficult with the pandemic, and so we're just going to send these checks out there. But when we're not adding value, but we're adding money, it's like watering down the soup. So that kind of sucks. Then they put water in the soup, it just doesn't taste as good.
The more we devalue the existing currency in circulation. And over time, the more dollars it costs to buy the exact same thing. Now, historically, over the last 40 years or so, the rate of inflation has actually been consistently going down thanks to increasing efficiency. Meaning we're now able to produce much more for less, and our money isn't losing value as fast as it once did. But things are quickly starting to change. That's because it's reported that nearly half of all US dollars in circulation were created in the last 18 months alone. And now that...
That's insane. That's like, think about it, it takes 32,000 years to count to a trillion at one number per second, and they're putting trillions of dollars into the economy, watering down the soup.
Our economy has, for the most part, completely reopened, that excess money is driving up the cost of everything else around us, leading us to the highest inflation that most of us have seen in our lifetime, at least according to my YouTube analytics. Now, on a large scale, inflation is really nothing new, and we've been seeing this every single year consistently since the beginning of time. It's why in 1955, a house cost $9,100, and now 66 years later, it's $374,000. Or how
What makes this kind of crazy is if we went back to the 1980s and asked people, hey, how much money would be good to have in a retirement plan? People might have said $250,000 or $500,000, or the people who are crazy said $1 million. But right now, if you're retired with $1 million and you don't know anything about stablecoin or cryptocurrency and you're putting it in the traditional banking system, you're getting a few measly % off your money, you might be a millionaire that's living like a pauper on $20,000 a year, and there might be some taxes going up in addition to the increased inflation. So, this is just like kind of bad news, but we'll have some solutions.
It used to be 92 cents, and today it's $3.69 in California. Anyway, right now, with inflation rising harder, better, faster, and stronger than the Federal Reserve initially anticipated, there's certainly the fear that it'll continue to grow out of control, it'll be too late to fix, and all of this comes right before another...
And part of the issue is, right now, with the government being nearly $30 trillion in debt, essentially, when interest rates are really low, they can kind of afford to pay that each month. But if they increase interest rates, is one of the things they do to kind of battle inflation, how are they going to pay that increased debt service with a higher interest rate behind it? It's kind of like if you have a mortgage and you can afford the payment right now, but you have an adjustable rate and that rate goes up twice as much, all of a sudden your payment doubles if you're on interest only. That could be really hard to kind of handle. And so they've got this kind of internal struggle and this battle they're going to have to deal with here.
Multi-trillion-dollar stimulus package. So what's going to happen? Well, the root cause of inflation seems to be broken down in 4 categories. The first is due to increased demand and not enough supply. Like the price of gas goes up as the more...
Right, and we see that with supply chain issues. I had to put a new deck on my cabin. The cost of the lumber was drastically more because of limited supply, and there's still this demand, especially when people were just hanging out at home a lot during the pandemic. So like, we should do some home improvement projects. And then all of a sudden, we run out of some of the supply, the price starts to increase.
More people travel, take vacations, use their car, do anything else that requires extra energy consumption. And once they can't create enough to keep up with demand, then boom, prices go up. Now, the second is said to be due to an increase of production cost. For example, throughout a labor shortage, businesses needed to pay more to attract new employees. However, to help compensate for that new increased cost, prices eventually had to rise. And over time, that cost gets passed on to you as the customer. This was such a significant effect that the concept was known as the Great Resignation, while Americans quit their jobs for higher paying opportunities. But with that comes at the cost of higher prices down the line, like what we're kind of seeing today. The third, there's also a source of inflation called built-in, because it's caused by the prices of goods going up, which causes people to need to make more money to pay for them, which then...
And there's also this luxury inflation where, look, I just stayed at a hotel. They're like, oh, we don't take care of the room every day anymore, or there's certain aspects that you're used to getting that they just kind of take away in order to be more competitive with pricing. So I don't know if you've been on a flight lately, but the meals on flights have drastically decreased. Like it went from being a meal to a package of goldfish. So that's another kind of form of inflation when they just start taking away certain benefits and things that you kind of got to enjoy over time.
Then begins the cycle all over again. This is also what's known as a wage price spiral. It's when rising wages increases disposable income, which increases demand for goods and services, which increases their price, which then causes demand for higher wages to pay for those higher prices. And then we get crazy, unstoppable, unsustainable price increases that have to end somewhere. And fourth, arguably one of the biggest problems that's not being addressed is the supply chain bottleneck. Now sure, increased monetary policy, rising wages, surging demand, and higher production costs.
And part of that happens when you just send people checks that are greater than what they could get going to their job, even if they don't go to their job. In 2020, we did a lot of webinars and helping people navigate everything with the PPP and all these other kind of incentives that were coming in. And just we had a lot of employers saying, man, I'm having a hard time keeping employment because people could just stay at home and get paid the same. And so that started to create some of this problem as well.
Certainly impacts the price of your everyday items. But the worst from all of this is shipping. See, most businesses rely on the imports of other countries, and often those items are shipped overseas in large containers that arrive to ports where they get sorted and sent to trucks to their final destination. But those shipping container costs are expected to rise by an average of 126% this year.
That's a lot, 126%. It sounds like some Shiba Inu coin that just went up today because people bought it.
And even worse, but spot rates of current shipments are 4.5 times higher than they were a year ago. Reports also show that reliability is half as good and delays are more than twice as long as they were in 2019.
Great, we pay more for less. Sounds awesome. Thanks, government.
Part of that has to do with the shortage of workers capable of handling such a high amount of inventory. And with increased demand of physical goods, it's created almost like this traffic jam of cargo vessels, sometimes waiting weeks at sea to dock, further delaying their arrival and costing significantly more money to operate. That's also
Yeah, and they're not out getting other stuff and bringing it in, so you can see how inefficient that is.
Causing manufacturers to begin slowing down their production, because after all, what's the point of increasing supply if it's just going to be stuck on a vessel anyway? And finally, we also have something called shadow inflation. This is what happens when you pay the same price for goods or services, but the quality or quantity of the item decreases without you knowing it. A user on Quora actually wrote a really interesting piece on what's called shrinkflation that I had to include here because these pictures are absolutely mind-blowing. As you can see here, now you get slightly less than before. The new peanut butter container needs less of it to be filled. You're secretly getting 4 fewer cookies. The bag is half empty, or is it half full? Normal-sized container, fewer markers. Same gel, less of it. In a way, this is a new common practice throughout so many industries to give you the illusion that prices are staying the same, even though technically you're paying more for less. Crazy, right? Now here's the thing, in small doses, inflation is actually encouraged, and when it's under control, it could actually be a good thing. The United States has really done its best to create a safe, stable, and consistent inflation rate of about 2% annually. And over the last 25 years, they've pretty much hit exactly that. For some people, that could be great. That means that certain assets will rise in value, like stocks, commodities, and real estate. So if inflation goes up 3% a year, then chances are so do your investments. Other people say that moderate inflation is necessary to keep our economy moving forward, because if we know our money is going to be losing a little bit of value every year.
I love all this monetary policy that comes out that's like, oh, this is healthy to have this happen. And when we've created all these artificial constructs like a Federal Reserve that's neither federal nor reserve, that then adds more money to the money supply. See, the GDP is our gross domestic product. When we divide that by the money supply, that tells us velocity. Velocity means how many times did dollars exchange hands that year for goods, services, and experiences. We want to increase velocity, which means we've increased value, not just increase prices. I want value behind that. I want efficiency. I want effectiveness. And when we start tinkering with monetary policy, a lot of times we're behind or we're ahead, and we're trying to take care of so many factors that are unknowable, like consumer demand and supply chain issues. Then what we're trying to do is predict something that is almost unpredictable. It's like trying to understand how every single play is going to go in a sporting event and exactly what the end result's going to be. Like, sure, you can use some predictive models and get some idea, but economists have way too many variables to control. And so now we have a whole lot of jobs in the government and with all these central banking institutions that start to create policy for individuals that interfere with free exchange. And to me, it's free exchange that really helps us out, where we get to choose where we spend our money, and we choose how we earn that money, and we choose how to interact with each other. But instead we go, oh, no, we need Big Brother. We need other people to make decisions for us because we're not smart enough to make those decisions. And as people start to make that, we lose responsibility. And as we lose responsibility, we lose prosperity. So I'm really concerned about the term healthy inflation and where that was really born and where that comes from. And sure, I guess it's okay if it's 2%, but the reality is it really 2%, or are we looking at what happens with college education? Because as the Stafford loan increases, all of a sudden price of tuition increases. Did the value increase with that? Well, we found that there's a lot of over-promising and under-delivering in this. I mean, CNBC just did a survey with 1,030-something-year-old millennials, and they said 52% said that their student loan wasn't worth it. And I think after talking to them for about 30 seconds, you might agree.
It encourages us to either spend or reinvest back into our economy, which keeps it growing. It's just seen as a healthy indicator that our economy knows exactly what to expect. Businesses can plan accordingly, and it's slow enough that most of us won't even notice it day to day. The problem, however, is when inflation begins to eat away at the purchasing power of your money faster than...
Right, because we've just added numbers to a screen. We're adding money to people's lives that they didn't create value for. And maybe that's not going towards education. It's going to complacency. Look, I get it. We have a major problem with the wealth gap. We have a major problem with poverty. We have a major problem with mental illness in this world. And I think it's great to invest in people and to support that. But at what point do we stop? And at what point do we create entitlements and entanglements? And at what point do we start to see cronyism, where major corporations have major lobbyists that are getting all the money that are coming from the government? And does it end up in just a few people's hands at the expense of the population? I think really wealthy people, inflation isn't going to be that much of a problem. The problem is really going to come down to the middle class and the poor that really can barely afford to hang on right now. And as those costs start to increase, what are they going to cut out when it's the basic necessities of life?
Then you're able to make it. And right now, wages just can't keep up. On the one hand, the Federal Reserve says that the inflation we're seeing today is transitionary, caused primarily by supply chain and shipping bottlenecks, which temporarily increases
not printing of money, not having people not add value for getting access to that money. They're saying it's supply chain issues. And where did those come from?
Their own costs. But others believe that it's a direct result of excessive spending and stimulus packages, which lead us closer to the point of no return. So what is it? Well, if we look back historically, we could see that since the early 1900s, we've had a few periods of excessively high inflation and several times where it's exceeded 10% annually. So what caused that, and could we see something similar to that again today? Well, the first most severe and probably the most obvious one happened from 1913 to 1919 as inflation surpassed 19%.
1913, when we came up with the U.S. Revenue Act, which introduced the income tax, was also a time where we have hyperinflation. Interesting.
I just realized that's a lot of 19s. Anyway, this was due to the spending of World War I and the vast manufacturing of supplies. Not to mention, it was also estimated that a shortage of resources led to increasing prices, which really was the perfect storm. After that, we have another period of intense inflation during and after World War II. During this time, there was a period of wage freezing, price control, and several other measures that were taken into place to prevent...
It's crazy to think where's the amount of money we spent on wars versus now the amount of money we're spending on everything.
Companies from having to increase their wages. But because of the severe deficit of spending involved in the war, more money had to be borrowed, more money entered circulation, and the extreme spending led to an...
More money was borrowed. Whether or not it had to be borrowed, I think, is an opinion.
Inflation of 13%. However, even though the time from 1900 to 1960 saw periods of extreme inflation and even deflation, they nearly balanced each other out, and until 1960, the average rate of inflation was only about 1% a year. That was until 1970, when inflation began hitting double digits by 1974. This was in part due to the removal of the gold standard, in which the value of our dollar was tied to the value of gold. That's led to the money that we have today, where $20...
And as we continue to add all of this money, and, you know, that's why we're seeing a major departure for so many people to move into cryptocurrency, because they're looking for something that, you know, we're not just adding more at any time that a government or a central bank is making a decision of. And people are just frustrated and tired of just being at the whim of politicians. And we know how many backroom deals are going on. We know how many people know what's going on versus don't know what's going on. And we know how much corporations are involved in this. So I think it's pretty frustrating.
is only worth $20 because we say it's worth $20. Otherwise, it's just a fancy piece of paper that costs 11.2 cents to make. Although after that, until now, inflation has remained rather steady. And throughout the last 40 years, it's hovered somewhere between 1% and 4%. That's because of stricter monetary policies and the Federal Reserve's target to keep inflation at about 2% annually, which is enough to promote spending, but not enough to devastate the entire.
Yet one of the interesting things during that time is government spending massively increased over, the last 20 years, especially when you look at those charts. It's been an incredible amount that, is some of it useful? Absolutely. Is some of it, unnecessary? Well, I think so. And a lot of it had to do with bailing out major companies and because of derivatives and because of all these crazy gambles that major institutions took and then got bailed out with the taxes that we pay, with adding more money to the money supply, which again, waters things down. A lot of this comes from mistakes and bad policy too.
Economy. But what about today? Because certainly we are in unprecedented times if inflation is rising at the fastest level in decades, right? Well, I'll be honest, that's the million-dollar question, and it just depends on who you believe. The Fed maintains
million-dollar question, or as we would have said in 1912, the trillion-dollar question. Because what's $1 million worth these days?
That it's temporary and we should start to see things begin to normalize throughout the next year. But if they're wrong, we could continue to see rising costs, higher interest rates, and higher inflation causing people to worry. Evidently, it's already enough of an issue to cause the IRS to raise their tax brackets for 2022. So that's telling.
Which is awesome, right? So now it costs you more to buy stuff. And this is what most people don't understand when they're deferring tax. Because of inflation, you're going to have to earn more money to buy the same things. And that money is going to be taxed at a higher rate, which means you have less left over to buy, unless, of course, you're wealthy and you can maximize all of the tax deductions and loopholes because you have capital gain assets or depreciation with real estate or a number of other things that middle-class people don't have the convenience of with their W-2 income. So it's a double dip here.
That inflation is becoming a driving factor into the future of our economy, but to what degree?
Has become, let's be clear, has become.
We don't know. Personally, I've said this year that inflation is going to be much worse and last much longer than we expect, and so far that's happened. But that's also a rather open-ended assumption that means absolutely nothing without a definitive time frame. And if I were to give it a random guess, I would say another 18 to 24 months before things begin to normalize. But please don't listen to.
Well, I mean, how much is the government going to continue to print and spend? When someone says we want a bigger, better government, that seems like an oxymoron. Bigger, better government doesn't typically go hand in hand. Again, we want them to protect our liberties. We want them to do some basic things. But there's so many other taxes you're getting hit with above the income tax that could increase because we still pay all these excise taxes you have to pay to live, to drive, to buy, to sell, to eat. Like there's all those other taxes in addition to the income tax, in addition to the stealth tax of inflation. Like we're seeing an entity without enough accountability start to ruin and take over aspects of our lives because of what they're doing to money and our ability to utilize it.
To me because I'm not an economist and I just do a lot of reading online because that's what I find interesting. That's it. Although in terms of what you could do about this, if you're investing, you should really be sticking with good, solid, long-term companies that you could hold for decades and then don't.
My question with that is, like, if you're investing in the stock market and we have such a disruptive nature with technology, what are those good long-term companies that are now being disrupted by blockchain technology and artificial intelligence technology? And ultimately, they might have constraints because of the money that they've taken from the government as to how quick they can maneuver or fire. I mean, there's a lot of factors. Like, what does that mean, good long-term companies? I personally have opted out of the stock market, which has done very well recently, but a lot of that has to do with the printing of money, having it artificially look like it's doing better than it actually is. And when will we have to see that come to a when taxes increase or people have to sell off just to pay their basic bills? And what starts to happen when people start to sell those stocks they've been holding on to because maybe they got money from the government and put it in the stock market, or because they're just automatically putting that money in, or if they eventually retire and start to take money out, we have some other factors to consider. What is a good long-term investment?
Don't sell. Could also look to refinance your mortgage or lock in a low interest rate now before.
a low interest rate does help you, because if there is high inflation, interest rates can help you when you have loans on a house or on a piece of real estate, because each year it feels like a lower payment because inflation helps you when you have that loan. Now, I'm not telling people they should go get into debt, especially not consumer debt, and especially if you're over leveraged and you don't know what you're doing when you're borrowing that money to invest, and maybe it's too speculative or risky. But if we're just looking at economics, when you have a loan for a long period of time, 10 years, 20 years down the road, that loan's going to feel like a much smaller payment due to inflation.
Eventually, they might end up increasing. This is exactly why I've chosen to keep my mortgages for as long as possible at the lowest possible interest rate that I could find. If we
Good advice.
do see worse and longer lasting inflation than we expected, it just means that it's going to be easier to pay off with future dollars. And when my interest rates are 2.8% fixed for the next 30 years, if inflation averages anything higher than that, it essentially means I'm getting paid to borrow money, which is an absolutely amazing concept. I'm also choosing to
Let's be careful with that. Getting paid to borrow money. I get what he's saying. 6.2% inflation, 2.8% on the interest rate. But the bottom line is you still have cash flow considerations and money that's leaving your pocket to service that loan. Make sure that's an appreciating asset or a cash flowing type of asset. Just want to have that clarification.
To diversify about 8% of my portfolio into a 50-50 split between Bitcoin and Ethereum, just as a hedge against whatever might happen. Plus, I'm a fan of
Yeah, definitely study crypto. I mean, I do think as a hedge, it could make some sense.
cryptocurrency in general, so I'm happy to allocate a small portion of my portfolio into something that I'm still trying my best to understand. Beyond that, though, day to day, it's probably a good idea to be a little bit more observant into the costs that you're paying, track your expenses, and do your best to shop around. Now, certainly, these are all reasonable habits.
Tracking expenses and shopping around will do a little bit. I don't know if it's going to do enough. Right now, it's time to increase your skill sets. It's time to invest and double down on yourself. Skill sets that matter, things that are going to add more cash flow, whether it's learning about business acquisition, whether it's learning about cryptocurrency, whether it's learning about how to communicate at a different level, reach more people, more deeply impact those people. It's a game of value creation. And if you're not in the game of value creation, you're just trading time for money. Inflation is a bitch. It's going to be really hard to deal with.
It's for any time, not just right now. But if prices continue to go up, then saving a little bit of money never hurts. And you should always just look to get the best deals anyway, as well as destroy the like button for the
Sure, but just make sure that you're investing mostly in yourself, not just spending too much time looking for the best deals, because the best deals are going to get you so far in this inflationary time. All right, good video overall. Hopefully that helps you out with a little bit of an understanding of inflation. It exists. It's worse than we think, and I think it's going to last a little bit longer than we hope for, and we're going to see a lot of tinkering that happens. So right now is the time to refinance like that he mentioned, but now is the time to really take and look and say, what can you invest in yourself that's going to help you earn more money? Because we see there's a higher demand for skilled workers. He's saying we don't have enough skilled workers. What are those skills? What are those avenues? What is consistent with the things that you want to learn with and do things with? I think that's going to help you battle and win this game. Want to master your money? Want to figure out the things that you could do to improve your finances? Click here and check out more videos like this on Money Matters.